Okay, we want to touch a little bit on um, body cavities, dissection planes, some body organs. We've talked a little bit about this in lecture already. This is just sort of a run through for the purposes of doing the lab. You'll remember from lecture the hierarchy of organization, right, where we go from tiny to larger things, and that's important in something like anatomy and physiology, because as we learn the properties of the tiny pieces, that allows us to determine the properties of the larger structures, and that gives us insight into how the organism works, right? So the tiniest level is the atom. Those are the building blocks of matter. Atoms hook up through chemical bonds to form molecules, which can hook up through more chemical bonds to form macromolecules, big molecules, which can associate together inside of cells to form organelles, which are chambers where special chemical reactions take place that let the cell survive. And this helps to separate chemical reactions that interfere with each other, and it also makes those chemical reactions more efficient. Okay, the smallest unit of living matter is the cell. Okay, it can do everything that we think of as a living process. It can grow, divide, respond to stimuli, move, okay, etc. It can reproduce, okay. Tissues are groups of cells with similar characteristics that do something that a single cell can't. The main tissue types are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous, and we'll learn more about those in the chapter on histology, okay. Organs are collections of tissues that work together to do a task that a single tissue can't. And we talked about in lecture the fact that the stomach is an organ in the digestive system that consists of epithelial tissue that lines the chamber of the stomach called the lumen. It has smooth muscle in its wall to help it churn and contract stuff. It has a blood supply, it has a nerve supply, and it has connective tissue that latches all those things together and latches the stomach in place inside the body. Okay? And that's an example of an organ, because a number of different tissues are cooperating to perform a task, which is chemical and mechanical breakdown of food, that a single tissue can't do. Okay? And then it's part of an organ system called the digestive system, whose job is to mechanically and chemically break down food so it can be loaded into the blood or the lymph, and from there make its way from the blood to the liver, and then from the liver to the rest of the body. And if it's in the lymph, it goes from the lymph to the blood, and then eventually back to the liver. Okay? And this is one of the organ systems that makes up the organism, which is you. Okay? And we talked about the fact that the organ systems have to cooperate in order for the organism to function. If one organ system breaks down, the organism will likely die. Okay. We talked about planes of section. Okay. We talked about the meaning of things like inferior, superior, medial, lateral, distal, proximal, ipsilateral, contralateral, superficial, and deep. Okay. What follows is a look at the language of anatomy. You've seen this in the lecture, but it's nice to review it.
The language of anatomy.
If you're gonna be successful in the study of anatomy, you gotta be tough. And there are certain terms that are used over and over again that we have to beat into your head so you can succeed.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
Good body.
Them good body.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
Hi, I'm Slim Goodbody, and I'm going to walk you through some of the terms you need to learn in order to understand anatomy. Anatomists have invented a special language that's really going to help us out as we chart our course through human anatomy. This language gives everyone who's familiar with it a universal understanding and a clarity when discussing the body, so we'll need to be really familiar with it.
For example, the word anatomy comes from the Greek words tumi, meaning to cut, and ana, meaning up, to cut up.
A lot of people use the term gross anatomy when studying the body. This is a specific type of anatomy. The term gross anatomy, contrary to popular belief, is not the study of boogies, puncture wounds, or the dad from Family Ties, but rather the study of bodily structures visible to the naked eye.
But since we're studying general anatomy, we're dealing with structures both visible and invisible to the naked eye. Because of this, it's important that you learn the terms that describe bodily orientation and direction. You want to be able to describe where certain parts of the body are located, and you also want to be able to understand us when we're describing where a structure is found relative to another one. So a firm grasp on these anatomical terms will help you get a handle on how to locate and identify different bodily structures. So the first term you'll want to memorize is anatomical position. This is the standard position we refer to when we describe the location of body parts.
These are the different regions of the body, and we talked about the fact in lecture that this will serve you well when we talk about things like the muscular system, the circulatory system, the skeletal system, the nervous system, the lymphatic system, and so on. Okay, this is sort of like a map of the United States, right? You have a general idea of where things are located based on the designation of that body region, which you're going to have to practice and memorize, and there's exercises on Connect and in the interactive useful websites that'll help you do that, okay, as well as flashcard sets that are on Quizlet, okay, so I strongly recommend you practice with those. And we talked about the fact that, for instance, we took the femur, right? We talked about the fact that the femur is the the femoral region. The femur is the long bone in the femoral region. The quadriceps femoris and the biceps femoris are muscles in the femoral region that help to move the leg down here, right? The femoral artery and vein carry blood through this region. The femoral nerve carries electrical impulses through this region, and so on, okay? And so this helps you down the road, because if you know that the femoral region is the thigh, then when you look for the word femoral in the name, you have an idea of where the object is located, okay? So just practice these body parts, work with them, okay? And you'll have an easier time of it when we hit the other body systems. We talked about planes of section, okay? The fact that you can cut the body into a transverse, a sagittal, or a coronal, which is also sometimes called a frontal plane, okay? The reason that this is an important concept is because we can use techniques that image the body in different planes in order to look at the condition of internal organs or disease processes and see if there's a problem that we need to address and what the exact problem is. Okay? Remember that a sagittal section cuts you into a right and left half, a coronal section into a front and back half, and a transverse section into a top and a bottom half. Okay? All right. Next topic is body cavities, so stay tuned.
If you poke and prod at your abdomen, you might be tempted to think that your body is a solid mass of bone, muscle, organs, and tragically for some of us, fat. But it turns out that our bodies actually contain many important spaces or cavities. Some of these cavities, like for example the nasal cavity, open to the outside of the body. However, most of our cavities are internal. Body cavities have several important functions. Firstly, they protect delicate organs, like for example the brain, from bumps and shock when we walk, run and jump. Secondly, cavities allow internal organs to change shape and size. For example, our lungs, stomach and bladder can all expand and contract because they sit inside cavities. And lastly, body cavities provide a warm, nurturing space for foreign creatures to implant into, grow and burst from in the Alien movies.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
The human body consists of two main cavities: the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. If you're not sure what the terms dorsal and ventral mean, check out my other video on anatomical terminology. Let's start with the dorsal body cavity. It can be divided into two parts: the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. The cranial cavity is the space formed by the bones of the skull. It contains the brain. The spinal cavity, which is sometimes also called the vertebral canal, is a space formed by the bones of the vertebral column. The spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. Next is the ventral body cavity. It can be subdivided into two parts: the superior thoracic cavity and the inferior abdominopelvic cavity, which is separated by a flat muscular sheet called the diaphragm. The thoracic cavity can be subdivided into the left and right pleural cavities and a central pericardial cavity. The pleural cavities contain the lungs, and the pericardial cavity contains the heart. Separating these three cavities is a partition called the mediastinum. The abdominopelvic cavity can be subdivided into a superior abdominal cavity and an inferior pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity contains the stomach, liver, spleen, kidneys, small intestine, and most of the large intestine. The pelvic cavity contains the bladder and internal reproductive organs. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for more Human Biology Explained videos.
So, we talked a little bit in lecture about the fact that there are cavities in the body, some of which are open to the outside world and some of which aren't. Okay? Cavities that are open to the outside world include things like um, the cavity that runs from the oral cavity down into the lungs, okay, so the respiratory tract. The digestive tract is open to the outside world at two ends, okay. The reproductive tract and the urinary tract are open to the outside world, okay. And as a result, all of those spaces are lined with something called a mucous membrane, which produces a sticky excretion called mucus that traps pathogens and flushes them out, and also keeps them from penetrating through the lining of those cavities and getting into the bloodstream, where they could cause real trouble. Cavities that aren't open to the outside world include the cranial cavity, the vertebral canal, the thoracic cavity, the pleural cavities within the thoracic cavity, the pericardial cavity around the heart, and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, the ventral body cavities, those that are in the front, are lined with what are called a serous membrane. Okay, so the pleural cavities, the pericardial, and the abdominal pelvic cavity are all surrounded by a double-layered membrane that produces a lubricating liquid that lets the internal organs move without friction, inflammation, and scarring. Okay, and it also serves to sort of stabilize the position of the organ inside the body so it doesn't twist, buckle, or kink. Okay. The dorsal body cavity, which is made up of the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal, is lined with a special set of membranes called meninges. The meninges, there's three of them, the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater, and their job is to stabilize the position of the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord, okay, and protect it, okay, and also serve as a route for blood vessels and for the circulation of a liquid called cerebrospinal fluid, which is manufactured from the blood in special hollow areas of the brain that are called ventricles. Okay, we'll learn about those later. Right? So all of these cavities are normally closed to the outside world. Okay? The pleural cavities contain the lungs, the pericardial cavity contains the heart, and the abdominal pelvic cavity contains the lower digestive, the urinary, and the reproductive system. Okay, as well as components of the lymphatic system, such as the spleen, some of the major lymph vessels, considerable number of lymph nodes, right? And we should also mention the blood vessels and the nerves that run through the region, okay? The penetration of any of these cavities by an injury brings up the possibility of infection and disease, and this can be very serious, all right? Because it can spread from the area of the injury into the blood, and from the blood to the rest of the body, where it could cause serious problems. So that's why we worry about any kind of injury that breaks the containment between the inside and the outside world, such as a ruptured appendix, okay? If we look over here, right, you can see there's a little projection that comes off a structure here called the cecum, which is part of the large intestine, right, which is made up of the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, and occasionally this gets plugged with poo, and the bacteria that live in the poo cause gas production, and then this little organ can swell up, and if it blows, right, it releases bacteria and fecal material inside the abdominal pelvic cavity that can cause the peritoneum in the abdominal pelvic cavity to inflame, and that's a condition called peritonitis. Anything that ends in itis is basically inflammation of, okay? And then that can lead to bacteria in the blood, and that's a condition called septicemia, and then that can lead to another condition known as death, okay? So you can't break containment between the outside world and these special cavities. You'll notice in this picture that we can divide the abdominal pelvic cavity into regions and quadrants, okay? The quadrants are right and left upper and right and left lower quadrant. Notice that these are the patient's right and left and not your right and left, okay? And the organs located here, right? For instance, in the right upper quadrant, we've got the liver, the gallbladder, a little bit of the stomach, some transverse and some ascending colon, and some small intestine, okay? In the right lower quadrant, we've got the appendix, the cecum, the ascending colon, portions of the small intestine, a little bit of bladder, okay? And then in the left upper, we've got some stomach, some liver, we've got some transverse and descending colon, we've got some small intestine, okay? And we've got the spleen way over back here, and portions of the pancreas, which are covered up by a lot of this other stuff, okay? And then the left lower quadrant, we've got the descending and sigmoid colon, the small intestine, the bladder. Portions of the reproductive system are also in the left and right lower quadrants, okay? As are portions of the urinary system, but they're covered up by a lot of these organs, okay? Now, why do we care, right? We care because if we use these regions or these quadrants to describe where a patient's problem is located, we have an idea of what the organ is messed up, okay? An example, right? If somebody came in with tremendous pain in the right lower quadrant, midway between the belly button, the navel, and the crest of the hip bone called the ilium, right? We would suspect a condition called appendicitis because the appendix lies right midway between those 2 points, okay? That's called McBurney's point if you're interested, okay? These regions over here have different names: the right and left hypochondriac, the right and left lumbar and right and left iliac, as well as the epigastric, umbilical, and hypogastric region. Now, you might look at these and say, well, those are words I'm not familiar with, okay? What do these names mean, okay? Well, let's break down some of this. Hypo means below, and chondriac means cartilage. So there's cartilage that attaches the ribs to this bone called the sternum. So the right hypochondriac region is the right half of the body underneath the chondral cartilages, okay? The epigastric region, epi means above, gastric means stomach. This is the region above the stomach. And the left hypochondriac region. The umbilical region gets its name because that's where your umbilicus attaches. That's where your navel is located. And that's the lifeline that brings in nutrients and removes waste products while you're in your mother's womb, developing from a fetus to a newborn, okay? And then the right and left lumbar regions, lumbar just means lower back, okay? And the right and left iliac regions, ilium refers to this broad bone, which is part of the coxal bone of the hip, okay? So there is the right ilium there, and there is the left ilium, okay? The other parts of the coxal bone are the pubis and the ischium, all right? So the right and left iliac region get their names from that. And then hypogastric region, hypo just means under, and gastric means stomach, okay? The reason we have to learn these different word roots and prefixes is because they come from Greek and Latin, and they got to the human body first and started cutting it open and naming things, so they got the naming rights, okay? So we have to learn their language. So my suggestion is that you get a book on medical terminology out of the library or get access to a website on medical terminology, and that will help you when you read your textbook understand what a lot of these different words mean when you see them for the first time, okay? Dissection planes are shown here, right? There's a look at a kidney in a model, right? We have a frontal section through the kidney cutting into a front and back section, okay? That's a model kidney, that's a real kidney, and there are some frontal sections through it, right? You got transverse section cutting it into a top and bottom half. That's what the kidney looks like when it's cut that way. And then we've got sagittal sections that cut it into a right and left half, okay? So you're going to get different features depending on how you cut the tissue, and they'll have a different appearance, okay? Abdominal regions on one of the models we use are shown here. Note the organs that are in this region, right? You can see the liver here, stomach, you got gallbladder, that little green thing right there, transverse colon, ascending colon. Down here you got the cecum and the appendix underneath the red tape, right? You've got ileum and jejunum and duodenum here, which are the parts of the small intestine, okay? There's descending and sigmoid colon. There's spleen over there, right? These are your lungs. This is the diaphragm, right? There's your heart, okay? And this is cut away so you can see the ribs here in the rib cage, okay? So the idea here is that you get familiar with these regions and the organs underneath them, and that'll let you answer questions about if a patient has a problem in that region, what's a possible candidate organ. Okay. Other features for human torso shown here. I won't go through each one, but it's good practice to take the printout, which has a blank version of this, and see if you can fill it in so you know which organs are where. Okay. And there's also good Quizlet flashcards that help you with this as well as the model website. So make sure to check those out under useful web links. Okay. More, this is a coronal section through the abdominal, pelvic, and the thoracic region, showing you a lot of the different features here that are covered up by some organs if they're in the way, right? We've removed the liver and the stomach here so that you can see the back of the abdominal pelvic region, the body wall here, right? We've removed the front of the lungs and the heart so you can see, for instance, the esophagus and trach, the primary bronchi back here going into the lungs, okay? Okay? You can see them with some more of the organs removed here. We've taken out the intestine, so you can see the kidneys and the adrenal glands and the spleen a little bit better. This is the abdominal aorta. This is the inferior vena cava, right? This is a portion of the sigmoid colon that leads to the rectum and the anus, and that's the urinary bladder down there, okay? And then we've got on the back of the human torso model, the cranial cavity where the brain's located, and the vertebral canal where we find the spinal cord, okay? So the spinal cord is tethered in place by structures called the denticulate ligaments, which you can see kind of radiating out like little teeth from the pia mater of the protective membranes around the spinal cord, so it doesn't wiggle left to right too much. And then there's a structure called the filum terminale that goes from the very tip of the spinal cord in the lumbar region all the way down to a little teeny tiny bone at the base, right above your anus, okay, which is called the coccyx, which used to be your tail, okay? And we'll learn more about those structures as we progress further, okay? So I will see everybody in the next podcast, and I thank you for listening.